Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Let's first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. For me, it's the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, a mob who've been gathering here for centuries upon centuries, continuously connected to the land, the waterways and skies of this area, caring for country before, during, and after disasters. So I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend this respect to the elders of the lands of where you're joining us today. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm joined virtually today by three very experienced and, for me, inspiring humanitarians who all happen to be women and RedR Australia trainers and deployees. Welcome, Georgina. Georgina is a gender equality, disability, and social inclusion and disaster risk reduction technical advisor. And last year, she completed a year-long project with Fiji Council of Social Services, working with women in remote communities in Fiji to connect them with what they need to be better prepared for disaster season. Then we have Hannah, who is a highly experienced gender and gender-based violence practitioner who's worked on a number of valuable programs around the world and in particular in the Pacific and Australia. And then we have Jess, who is both a practice social worker and senior humanitarian operations manager with extensive experience in conflict and disaster response and recovery, including reconnecting families displaced by war. And I'm Sally. I'm the strategic communications manager at RedR Australia. And basically, I'm someone who likes to brag about interviewing really interesting people who are doing the good work. So the UN Women theme this year for International Women's Day is March Forward. This commemorates 30 years since the UN's Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action for Achieving Gender Equality. This theme isn't about marching or anything military-minded, but it is about taking positive and progressive action towards gender equity. We know from our work in disaster, women, men, boys and girls are not impacted the same or in equal measure. So today we want to discuss this issue with our panel of very experienced women. First, let's start with some context. Georgina, what are some of the specific challenges women and girls face after a disaster strikes, either in conflict or areas affected by natural disaster?
Thanks, Sally. So from the evidence, we know that globally in disasters and conflict zones, women and children are at higher risk of human trafficking, an increase in gender-based violence, poor maternal health outcomes, a lack of access to family planning, as well as STD and HIV management, economic loss and reduced life expectancy. But in high-level discussions about disasters and conflict, the specifics of what these things actually mean or how they look on the ground is sometimes missing. So the work that I did in Fiji was working with an NGO that works from a very grassroots perspective. And that helped inform my understanding of the specific impacts on women and girls in disasters. So by looking at these 5 examples that I'm going to give you, we're trying to, I guess, center women and children and not erase their experiences in policy making and programming. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about are seemingly obvious, but if we are to march forward, as the theme is encouraging us to do, we also need to be aware of these basic and simple things that remain problematic in disasters. So in Fiji, for context, in April 22, Fiji was hit by a Category 4 cyclone. Then 6 months later, Tropical Cyclone Yasa, a Category 5, and then 1 month later, a Category 3. And given that we are in Australia waiting for a Category 2 cyclone to hit Southeast Queensland and Northern New South Wales, it's interesting to consider the experience of Fijians who had 3 major and severe cyclones in a space of 12 months. So firstly, food. Most women are reliant on local agriculture. Disasters and extreme weather events mean that markets don't operate. It also means that urban women have no access to food because they're reliant on rural women running the markets. In disasters, food from aid organisations can take days to reach communities, and in the interim, the burden falls to women and children to go out and look for that food. Unfortunately, in times of extreme scarcity in the Pacific, it's not uncommon for women and girls to resort to sex work for money if food is not available. Secondly, water. Similarly, access to water in disasters is always compromised. When water is delivered, it's often delivered to central points, which means that women with disabilities, single women households are at extreme disadvantage in accessing that. In some of the remote settlements that I worked in Fiji, they were forced to survive on unboiled creek water after Tropical Cyclone Winston because there was no access to their communities. Similarly, in informal communities, and there is a growing number of informal communities in not just Fiji, but the world, so they're communities without access to basic infrastructure. The toilets are pit toilets, and in weather like extreme rain and cyclones, the pit toilets overflow and the floodwaters are contaminated with sewage, and that falls to women to rectify that issue. Evacuation centres, that's something that is an ongoing challenge, and women and children are disadvantaged there because there are often not enough toilets, or there's no privacy. Remote and rural women can't access evacuation centres because they can be up to 2 hours by car, and they may not have a car. So they are forced to shelter in place, often in shelters that aren't cyclone proof. Similarly, the transgender and gender diverse community choose not to access those evacuation centres because they are not safe for them. Just lastly, elderly women and women with disabilities are also at extreme risk in disasters. They're reliant on family and community to make sure that they have what they need, and oftentimes in disasters, those things aren't available. Preparation and early warning systems. Not all women have access to these. It's interesting to think that as the cyclones hitting Queensland, our government's talking about not having a federal early warning system either. So in Fiji and the Pacific, there are lots of barriers to having a national system, including access to the internet. Not everybody has a telephone. In some places, literacy is low, and disaster risk education, mitigation techniques are difficult to build in when there are existing core vulnerabilities for women. So a lot of emphasis is given to building resilience in these communities. However, I think it's important to address core vulnerabilities to save lives and prevent harm in climate and extreme weather events. Thank you.
Thanks, Georgina. That's great context. And obviously, this is very reflective as well of the case study of your learning and experience from the deployment with Fiji. And it just extends those themes that all repeat themselves, we find, but obviously it's modified to the location and the communities that it's impacting. So let's move to the next one, Jess. Yes, Jess. I'm reading. In your experience, how can we better help women access support or resources during a crisis?
So thanks. I think Georgina illustrated really clearly some of the really practical challenges that women and children face on the ground. And within the Red Cross, we have a suite of work around protection, gender and inclusion, which cuts across all of the sectors, all of the different technical sectors of work that takes place. And we have a 4-point framework. So we look at dignity, access, participation and safety. And that's a good way of being able to think into any situation. And so each of those elements gives us a different way of thinking about what the needs might be, what some of the risks might be, and how we could take steps to address them. So dignity, for example, relates primarily to psychosocial needs. So respect, self-respect, culturally appropriate assistance, for example, psychosocial support. So that might be around clarifying the fate of missing family members, making sure people have appropriate menstrual hygiene management options that are suitable to their culture and their context and practices, psychosocial support to recover from sexual assault or trauma, for example. These are the types of things that we could offer, when we start to think about dignity. Access is around levelling the playing field so that people can receive assistance based upon need, and that it doesn't just flow to the fastest or the strongest or the most assertive or able-bodied people in the community. And so that might be around the location and timing of services, or being able to access around caring responsibilities, making sure that information goes out in a way that's accessible and meets the literacy capabilities and education levels of women. And often women don't have access to the formal networks, the disaster planning committee, for example, that may be more dominated by men in a community. Participation is really critical as well. We've really moved away and continue to move away from the idea that communities are passive recipients of assistance, towards seeing them as active members of communities. They're on the front line of response and recovery for themselves, for their families, in their neighbourhoods, and also at the national level, and looking at ways of engaging them to reduce the risks, volunteer to support each other, consult them about programs and solutions, encourage women's leadership so that we get those different voices at the table. And then the last one relates to safety, and that there's kind of two parts to that. One is about making sure that people are physically safe and protected from some of the risks and hazards. So that's around good needs analysis and good planning, but also around doing no harm and making sure that the work that we do doesn't perpetuate further harm among vulnerable people in our communities. And so a lot of that's also around prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, which I'm sure Hannah can talk about at much greater length. But so I think for me, I've always found that 4-point framework, dignity, access, participation and safety, really helps in thinking within any context and any type of programming about what opportunities there are to actually do better.
Yeah, that sounds very logical. Very helpful framework to refer to. Thank you so much for that, Jess. Just bringing up those ideas of how women, men, boys and girls are impacted differently. And we'd mentioned earlier that we know when it comes to protection and equality, women are more vulnerable to gender-based violence during disaster and conflict. So, segue to Hannah. We know that violence against women and girls increases in disaster and conflict settings. What measures are most effective in addressing and preventing gender-based violence in these contexts?
Yeah, thanks, Sally, for the question. And I think a lot of what I will say will flow on also from what Georgina and Jess have been discussing. So, yes, we know that women and girls experience violence, gendered violence in every country in the world. That occurs in times of peace, that occurs in Australia, that occurs everywhere, but that it is exacerbated by disasters. And so in order to effectively address gender-based violence, there's quite a lot of components, but I think the absolutely critical thing that we think about as humanitarians that might go into a crisis to respond is that we look to understand what services have been provided pre-crisis, and that we look to strengthen, to build upon, to support those services. For gender-based violence, there is a really significant barrier for survivors to access help. They must trust those services. They must feel safe. They must feel like their confidentiality will be respected in order to even disclose their experience and to go out and get help. So whilst, localization is a critical component of all humanitarian response, this is so core to gender-based violence. And when we do go in to address gender-based violence, we know that a survivor will have multiple needs, and therefore we need to have a multi-sectoral response to adequately address those needs. So we need to be able to bring people together. So the types of response services that we might deploy in an emergency might be things such as a health response which includes clinical management of rape. We might have a psychosocial response, which would include counselling and case management for survivors in an accessible way, in a way where people know about it, feel safe to enter that space, to access that service. So that might be helplines, hotlines. It could be having a women's and girls safe space in a refugee camp where you can go and engage in activities, but also access counselling at the same time, so that you're not identified as a survivor when you're accessing that service. Because again, we know there is substantial stigma that survivors face. Of course, alongside those aspects of psychosocial support and safety, we need to also think about recovery and alongside that, access to justice for survivors. So that might be things such as training the police force in interviewing survivors, in interviewing perpetrators, even just in core concepts of violence against women and girls. It might be helping to set up, dedicated desks and things like that, and looking at how we can support access to the court system, for example, or where those courts don't exist, what other mechanisms of justice can we set up and deploy? And as you can imagine, this is not exactly straightforward. So there is also a really significant focus on coordination and referral pathways, case management, things like that in a GBV response. Aside from those core response services that are absolutely life-saving and critical, we also know that all humanitarian actors have a really strong role to play in mitigating those risks associated with gender-based violence. So we heard of those from some of those from Georgina, and Jess, you touched on those as well. And that could be simple things like the wash sector, ensuring there's adequate lighting around latrines in camp settings, for example. It could be, working with food security around how and when they do distributions, so we can minimise some of those risks associated with sexual exploitation and abuse as well. So there's a lot of things that actually can be done through that risk mitigation model. And there's some really great guidance and work that's been done on that to really lay out what are those kind of key steps. And then finally, Sally, just to mention that there is an increasing recognition, and it's really heartening actually, that we can't only stop there, that we must also look at prevention. And so what I mean by prevention, and it is a kind of a word that can be a little bit opaque, is that, we're talking about behaviour change programs for perpetrators, we're talking about male behaviour change programs, but we're also talking about addressing those gendered drivers of violence. And for a long time, this was kind of pushed aside in the humanitarian sector, but I think in the face of so many protracted crises, and particularly when we saw, Syria happening at the same time as Yemen, as, things in South Sudan, going ahead, we really saw this increased, focus on prevention. And an example of, a critical prevention program, and I see some colleagues here on the call as well that have done work in preventing child marriage. But, that is one that has gained some increased focus. So that could be looking at what are those practical realities facing parents that are forcing them into the decision to marry off their girls. It could be looking at what are those social sanctions or social rewards that mean parents think it's actually, falsely think that it's actually protective of their girls to marry them off at a very young age. And, designing different programs that address that. Could be cash and voucher, it could be communications and behaviour change. There's a whole suite of things, and it's really, again, down to those contextual factors in terms of what will be effective. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you, Hannah. That was great. Yeah, there's just so much, and I think every one of you has really pointed out ways that humanitarians work in gender, but also the mainstreaming, the need to mainstream. And I keep thinking about training, because obviously we did deployments and training, but what you're talking about, preparedness, there are things that can be done. So I'm just going to shift a little bit. Let's think about women who work in the sector. So Jess, as someone who's worked in disaster response, whether it be in Australia or overseas, what advice would you give other women who are looking to work in the sector?
Well, there's a lot you could say in this space. I guess the first thing is to emphasise just how important it is that women, gender diverse, and people from all sorts of backgrounds actually have a seat at the table and are represented within our sector. We're here to support all people from all walks of life, and it's really important that that managers and program leaders and people working on the ground also reflect the diversity of the communities that we're here to support, and also have an understanding of, vulnerability and what it is to be marginalised as well. As I was just listening to Hannah's podcast episode, a little plug there, but and she was talking about how within the humanitarian sector, women are very well represented in the earlier stages of their career, and then as people move on and as time goes on and you go up to the higher ranks, there's less and less women represented at the higher ranks. And I think it is in many ways the humanitarian sector represents a very demanding career, especially demanding on your time and your mobility, and that can be very challenging when we have caring responsibilities. I think it's also important to see it as demanding, but also see it as a long career. And there's quite a bit of mobility within the sector, which means that we can actually move in and out of roles and in and out of phases of our professional life. And I think that many people, whether you have families or other responsibilities, you'll need to expect that life might require you to take breaks from that very all-consuming and demanding profession. And so I guess my main advice would be for people to keep developing themselves as professionals. Keep an eye on as to how those types of skills could be transferred into their home context or into other types of contexts, so that they can continue to have the continuity and they can continue to make a contribution and use their skills, but maybe in different ways if needed. If you need to step back for a little while, I know for myself, I'm stepping back for a little while. I'm between deployments and having a career break for a while, and that's something that you have to be willing and able to do. The other thing, I know we talk a lot about the sort of unpaid extra labour that we might do, but it is also really important to try and support and mentor other women, and make sure that we're working within our sector for that long-term cultural change, which comes from having greater diversity within our workforce, and that's all the way from the local level, from local communities acting and responding, and as we're seeing in Queensland right now, all the way up to the global level.
Thanks, Jess. What about Hannah and Georgina? Anything you would like to add there? Advice? I mean, advice is quite endless, but I mean, I would also suggest that in my experience, there are many, many women in the sector. It's just the way that it impacts the work that you're doing and the teams that you're working in is really changes depending on where you are. So from your experience, Hannah and Georgina, is there anything else that you would like to add to that? You did it very well, Jess, by the way.
Yeah, I think Jess summarized it perfectly.
Yeah, I think maybe just that there are lots of opportunities in Australia, just to echo that point that Jess made, to use the skill sets that you have. So we might have people on the call who are well established in their humanitarian careers, but because of the current climate or because of personal reasons are looking at, how do they continue? And I think just to say, like, that the three of us all have different ways of continuing our humanitarian careers, and some of that is, working in academia, working in consulting, doing short deployments, working for organisations here in Australia, things like that. So, just wanted to add that.
Agreed. Sounds good. So, Hannah, I've got another question for you. As we commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, what are the key priorities for achieving gender equality in the next decade, especially in the context of development and humanitarian action?
Yeah, thanks, Sally, for the really big question. And I think just to acknowledge that this is a really critical and challenging time for the whole humanitarian sector, and that we're facing really diminishing operational space, diminishing funding, and really a strong backlash to, our core mandate and what we do. And that's going to be really hard for everyone. But we know actually that those cuts are going to have greater impact on women and girls out there in experiencing crisis. We've seen with the shutdown of USAID and the cutting of other aid budgets, such as the UK, that there is directives around removing programs that have language such as women, girls, inclusion, diversity, equity. So, we know that it's going to have a really significant impact on those on that work, on addressing GBV, on the mainstreaming of gender, on women's economic empowerment programs and others. So I think it's while it's really scary, it's also a critical time that we look at how we can hold on to the gains that we have already made, how we can consolidate those, and to recognize that really those gains haven't been equally felt as well. So we can see that, there are vulnerable women and girls that are being left behind. I think also just to recognize that this kind of rise in this anti-gender language reflects a broader rise in anti-gender movements that has been tracking for 5 years plus, and so we need to take that into account when examining how we move forward with the critical agenda. So taking stock of that, I think we need to really double down on some of those key areas that have been mentioned by Georgina and Jess. So, we need to continue our focus on women's economic empowerment, equality, women's access to markets in crisis situations, in development contexts. We need to continue the work on ending violence against women and girls. And we must, increase our focus on women's rights and experiences in the private sphere. And I think that's something that Jess just touched on, from a more personal perspective for us working in the humanitarian sector. But we know that women around the world continue to take on the burden of substantial unpaid household and care labour. And this has such big flow-on effects for them, in their workforce participation, in exacerbating family violence, in creating time poverty, and the wonderful term of women's drudgery, and really ultimately limiting their freedom. And this is pervasive around the world, but we know in times of crises, it's women and it's girls, often adolescent girls, who act as the safety net and take up a lot of the slack for their families. So, they might be taking on more care work, responsibilities around managing scarce food resources, for example, which is something that came out really strongly from the Pacific going through COVID, that it was really women and girls stepping up to manage that, create backyard gardens and address where there wasn't, food in the market anymore. And we know that women and girls in every country and around the world experience violence, both in the public sphere and also in private spaces, and that for many, homes are the most dangerous place to be. And so thinking through, where we can focus some of our efforts in development and humanitarian work towards progressing, gender equality, I think sometimes we also need to, focus down on where we can have an impact in terms of freedom for women and girls, and allowing them to then pursue some of those other areas that can progress equality. But I think, personally, I would like to open that up and hear a bit more from Georgina and Jess, if that's okay with you, Sally.
Sounds good. Thank you, Hannah. Georgina and Jess, it is a big question, and it does lead into our next question as well. So I'm going to ask the next question, and then we'll answer it all. We'll have all of the answers. So how do you envision the future of women's leadership in humanitarian disaster response efforts, and how do we march forward with gender equity, equality, for women and girls?
I'm happy.
Go for it, Jess.
I'm happy to jump in and say I think that we really need to maintain a long-term view. It's true we've got we're in quite challenging times right now, but we also need to see the gains that we have made as a as humanity over the last 200 years, over the last 50 years, over the last 30 years. And we need to hold on to that optimism that drives us forward. Despite the bleak headlines, there are millions of people who are working every day at the local level up to the national and the global levels to improve the situation of themselves and their communities. And we need to keep looking for those positive stories and, appreciate that work that happens and continue to support those institutions that help to make the world a better place. I think, humanitarian organisations or international law or human rights conventions, they can seem slow moving and it can feel frustrating at times, but in this society where we've got so much polarization and distrust, we actually need to continue to keep that positive view, and continue to support those institutions that will promote peace and safety and prosperity.
Lovely. Georgina, would you like to throw yourself in there?
I was just going to add that my experience in the Pacific was that there are so many capable women leaders who are in unpaid positions, working tirelessly as volunteers, fundraising, coordinating first responses to disasters. And I think the future of disaster response in the Pacific is for organisations to collaborate with local leaders, to listen to traditional knowledge that is decades long and extremely well tested, and to put our funding in a sustainable way into those systems that already exist.
Thank you. That sounds, I agree with so much, if not everything that has been said. And to be fair, positive movements aren't always measured in news cycles, and they're not always spoken about in Parliament, Houses of Parliament, but we must stop to acknowledge the everyday changes and gains. And, I see that when I pick up my kids from school. I see it even in the, on the radio, in music. There are so many ways we can measure that while some things feel like they're going backwards, we are not completely going backwards, and we continue to be heard and strive to march forward for positive change, for gender equity. So that brings us to the end of our organised questions, and we would like to invite questions from the people who are Zooming in. So please put something in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll give this a go in our last few minutes of our session. Thanks, Rachel, for monitoring the chat. Oh, let me just quickly do a shout out. There was a lovely plug earlier by Jess on Hannah's podcast. So RedR Australia do have a podcast series, and we can offer you Hannah J, and this week we've published Jess Letch. Georgina, we may need to talk. But Georgina's also helping us out. We have another session coming up as part of Humanitarian Partnerships Network Week later in the month. A session that will be talking about traditional knowledge in disaster risk reduction, hosted by our wonderful CEO, Dr. Helen Durham. And Georgina is part of that panel, as well as a couple of our other deployees and ATs, Simeone Bulla and Vuli. So look out for that across our website, socials, newsletters, everywhere we publish. But we invite you to join that session. That will be it'll be streamed live 19th of March. Yeah, 7 p.m. Melbourne time. So if there's any questions, we can address those now. Oh, Olivia. Do you want to unmute? Thanks, Olivia. Rachel's going to unmute you so you can ask a question of the panel. Go ahead.
Okay, hopefully, can you hear me now? And can you see me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so thank you for this opportunity. I worked in Fiji many years ago. I think it was around 2011 or shortly after that. And at the time, this was shortly after the Japanese tsunami. And while Fiji's a long way across the Pacific, there was still a tsunami alert. And the water actually went up to about 6 inches, so it wasn't a big issue. But when we were talking to the women at the some of the government workers at the Ministry of Welfare, Gender, they said, oh, actually, when the alert went out, the first thing they thought was they had to, run up the mountains, find some higher ground, run up there, and getting their families together and going up. And I said, okay, but you work at the Ministry of Welfare, what about your clients? And they said, it never occurred to us to continue to do our work during the response. Our first thoughts, in fact, our only thoughts were for our families. And then one of the other things that we started to talk about in this post-event debrief was assessments. And they were concerned that when the governments, the NDMO, would send out people to do assessments, everyone goes and you go and assess the number of bridges that have been destroyed, the roads that have, infrastructure that's gone. And I said, well, is there a way that you could assess the situation with human beings, your clients? And that caused a whole lot of thought and discussions that, yeah, they could actually do their job. They could actually go and do the assessments. But one of the barriers to going on the assessments is getting a seat on the helicopter, right? It's the helicopters that do the flyovers, and there's only 4 seats or something available. So another issue was, well, what about doing the training that is offered by the NDMO and the government on formal assessment techniques? And you go out with that as well as your protection skills and do multiple. So I want to know whether there's any, this was like 15 or so years ago. So I want to know whether there's any of that sort of thing happening, especially for you, Georgina, in the places, where you guys have worked. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivia. I think if you went back now, you'd find like huge changes in that area because post-disaster assessment and response where aid is given, but also assessments done simultaneously is now really par for the course. So it's not just government, but government in collaboration with on-the-ground NGOs, and then really nice work feeding those assessments to UN agencies and to bigger aid organizations. But certainly the NDMO are 100% like their disaster comms and disaster center sets up in a disaster and it runs 24/7, and they are coordinating the response along with sending their government staff. There are NGO staff and international staff. So yeah, I'd say in the last 15 years that's come a really long way.
Yeah. So actually, I think I'm raising this as part of Jess's question about we should recognize the gains. We forget to recognize the gains so often. And this is a fantastic one. Thank you.
I would add, I don't have the figures in front of me right now, but if you want to see a stark illustration of the gains that have been made, have a look at cyclones going to Bangladesh. And if you go back to the 1970s, a Category 4 cyclone would kill 400,000 people. In recent years, that number's gradually gone down to take a sort of zero off each decade until now a similar size cyclone might kill a dozen people. And that's literally hundreds of thousands of lives saved, and often women and children are the most vulnerable in those contexts. So you see huge numbers of women and children killed in the 1970s in some of those big cyclones that hit South Asia, and we're really seeing massive changes in the way that we're preparing for disasters, managing information about disasters, and reducing our risks and our exposure.
Thank you. Thanks, Jess and Georgina, and thank you so much, Olivia. Olivia is actually one of our RedR Australia roster members as well. We've got another question from Emily. So Emily, if you'd like to ask your question, please do.
Thank you very much. I couldn't work out how to raise my hand, so thank you. I'm interested, and this is perhaps for Hannah, around GBV prevention and climate crisis programming. So how do we incorporate GBV prevention as a targeted activity and perhaps as mainstreamed in program design as well, that it fits within a climate response initiative, and it complements it? So I find, yes, how can we integrate it so that it complements a climate response program?
Thanks, Em. Nice to see you too. Great question. I think it's a tricky one, and maybe depends on the type of climate response program you're designing and implementing. But I think just a few examples of things that I've seen done pretty well. Like across the Pacific, more than 10 years ago, there was a strong push to have national climate change policies and action plans, have like the women's crisis centres and the women's affairs departments actually sit in and be part of the drafting teams on those action plans, which at the time, I was working with UNICEF and we had colleagues around the world just saying, what are you doing? That doesn't make any sense. But, the Pacific was really far ahead in that instance. And it's shown in terms of outcomes for things such as like integrating climate resilience within women's crisis centres, for example. So that's probably more of a response side. But I think from a perspective of prevention, I think a kind of key area is around engagement of girls and women in like climate action, and how do we tie that with kind of maybe doing some gender social norms change at the same time. So particularly with the youth climate movement in the Pacific, they've been pretty good at that. Is really focused on young women's leadership in the climate movement and putting women at the front of as their face. And so it's a little bit, I guess, hard to pin down in terms of specific activities, but I hope that gives you some principle.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Because I'm looking to always incorporate that social norms change and having those dialogues around gender equality, but then I get pushed back because people say, where does this fit in climate crisis? And it's not the focus of the project, but I'm always trying to find ins for having that prevention aspect.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, normalize it, hey? Integrate it into everything. Thank you so much. That was an excellent question, and Hannah, very helpful answer. We're going to invite Helen to ask one closing question.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you so much for the speakers. And sorry for my strange images on my computers are not working well today. They're moving around. I think that was extraordinary, and each of the stories unpacked profound issues. I had a short question, and it circles back to what we've all been saying. We are in dark days in one way, but on the other hand, we don't stop to breathe and see how far we've come. And we've heard beautiful examples, I think, in the last, and thank you, Olivia and Jess and others. I was just wondering if there was one thing everyone wanted to a young person. I've got a 20-year-old daughter who's really interested in these issues. What would you say is the key thing we have to embed for a young woman wanting to either move forward and make an impact in this space that we all feel so passionate about, equity and dignity, safety and access? Thank you. Thanks for everyone.
Who would like to pick that up to begin with?
I have a really short answer, so I'll just go quickly. I think for me, it's solidarity. So women are really powerful, and we're also very giving. And I think, finding that solidarity with other young women and with also older women in the sector, if it's, or in whatever sector she's looking to work in, I think is absolutely critical. And that's also, I think, a positive in terms of how far women's movements have come over the last 40 or 50 years is really incredible, and the change that they've been able to make is incredibly powerful.
Thanks, Hannah.
I think I'd probably say collaboration is key. And I guess as a young person, you may feel the burden of having to achieve so much, or there being so much yet to do. But I think, yeah, so similar to what Hannah's saying about solidarity, but yeah, to collaborate, to realize that when we work together, it's achievable, that there's so many incredible people to be able to call on if you need support and if you want guidance. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Thanks, Helen. This is an interesting question. I guess I've done my fair share of speaking to Masters of Development students and things like that, and they often come to me with this question, and it is quite difficult because as you would know, like RedR, for example, it has a roster, and they're often taking mid-career people who've got a great amount of skills and experience working in perhaps the Australian context, and then they're taking those skills and they're using them in international contexts. And for me, usually when young people come asking me how they can forge a future working in international aid or development, I usually ask them to think about what kind of skills they can develop. And it can be a diverse range of skills. There's so many different profiles of people working in this sector. It could be nursing skills. It could be managing a mechanics workshop. It could, there's logistics, there's management, there's psychosocial, sexual and gender-based violence. There's a wide range of skills that you can develop. And to hone those skills, make use of the great education that we have in Australia and hone those skills potentially working in the local context, and then think about how you might utilise them in new contexts. Because we're not it's no longer a case where people can just sort of take themselves somewhere and just be useful. Local people are doing the work on the ground, and our job is usually to help that work function more smoothly and to keep the wheels turning behind the scenes. So, for myself and for many other people, I started working in local programs with Australian Red Cross, got to understand how the system worked, and then sort of slowly moved into an international context. And I think most people, as we know through the RedR process, they've got amazing skills that they might have developed working with their local communities, maybe in Indigenous communities, and then it's around supporting local people to actually be delivering those services themselves, but maybe taking a bit of a guidance and a coaching sort of approach. So I would say, get to understand the types of skills that are in demand and train yourself up so that you've got some of those skills that you can help to impart and support people who are working on the ground.
Thank you. Great question, Helen, and great responses. We're wrapping up now, and it's always a good sign when we get to the end of the session. My mind's going crazy in a very positive way. I've got so many thoughts in my mind about gender equity and equality and what this really can mean. And one thing I've really learned this week is we've been talking about it in this session, and we've been talking to people in the team and people outside of the team. Everybody's idea of what is more equal or equal is a little bit personal and different. So we need to be patient with people who are at different spots in their belief and in what they're pursuing. But we keep going. So thank you so much for feeling like we're having a little win here. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we'll hope to bring you more amazing sessions in the near future. Thanks, everybody.